Hence the reason why mothers will say, I feel guilty about everything, because we have absorbed this idea from books, fairy tale, romance, everything that we've been fed about women, that we become mothers and we forget our needs. So the moment you try and advocate for your needs, or you say to your kids, sit there, I'm going to do 5 minutes yoga, you start to feel guilty because you're bumping up against that conditioning that says, no. A good mother is a martyr. She forgets about herself. A good mother doesn't work. A good mother prepares home-cooked meals every single night. This is a journaling exercise I ask my clients and people in my community to do. Grab a piece of paper, write a good mother, ... and get out all of that conditioning. Your mind will be blown.
Well, hello there, and welcome to this episode of the Terri Cole Show. Any of you mothers or parents out there, well, this episode is going to be for you, because I am talking to Zoe Blaskey, who is the originator. She's the founder of Motherkind, which is a personal development platform for parents, but she also has a really popular podcast. It's often the number one podcast in the UK for parenting podcasts. And she talks a lot about how to navigate modern parenthood, especially with being a mother, and what are the things that we come up against, and how can we have less pain and less worry and less guilt and less stress in our parenting. How do we get away from the compare and despair and the people pleasing and the perfectionism and the worrying about all the zillions of things that we could be worrying about, when really it's about, how do you want to live and how do you want to teach your kids to live? Anyway, she says it all very much better than I just did. So I hope that you enjoy my interview with Zoe Blaskey as much as I really did enjoy spending time with her. I'm super excited to welcome Zoe Blaskey to the show. Welcome.
Thanks, Terri. I'm really excited.
Yeehaw. So many things to discuss. We were talking a little bit off camera about the challenges of motherhood. And this is basically your life's work, is sharing your own experiences and coming up with ways to support people with modern mothering and what it looks like. So can we start with what inspired you to create this entire coaching and educational platform and your podcast and all the things that you do around motherhood? What was your own experience? What inspired you to do this?
Well, I mean, unsurprisingly, I think all the great things in life come from someone's frustrations and struggles. And that was exactly my experience with this. So I had a really empowering birth experience, loved it, and really struggled with the first year of motherhood. So I'd been a decade into lots of therapy, lots of 12-step programs, lots of unraveling behaviors. And I honestly felt like motherhood in that first year was starting again. So what I found was that all of that old conditioning that I'd spent a decade in therapist offices came back. I started to control everything. I was super fearful. I had anxiety. It really came back strong. I was perfectionist. I started to lose trust in myself. I started to almost compulsively read parenting books, which were making me feel worse. It was almost a self-abuse. Like they would make me feel worse. They would take my power away. And after about 9 months of this, I started to look in other places. So I started to look to content around healing generational patterns, about the mother wound, about the mother-child relationship. I started to look to people like Dr. Siegel and Dr. Gabor and Dr. Neufeld, all these just incredible people. It completely changed how I felt about my experience that I was going through. I learned this word matrescence, which no one had ever talked to me about. It was a completely new word for me. And yet the moment I heard it and learned about it, it completely changed how I felt.
Well, tell us what it means.
Well, matrescence is just like adolescence. So it's the anthropological term that refers to the becoming of a mother. So when you're a teenager and you become an adult, when you go through that adolescence, people expect it to be a bumpy time. You're figuring out your identity. Who am I now? I'm in this sort of holding phase. Your hormones are changing, your body's changing, who you are in the world is changing, and your relationships are changing. It is exactly the same in motherhood, particularly those early years. It's actually meant to be a bumpy time of figuring out, who am I now? How does my relationship work now that there's this, second or third little person in it? What are my values now? Does my work still fit? That was my experience. My work just didn't feel as important anymore. Your hormones change, your brain changes, your DNA actually changes when you become a mother, and the part of your brain responsible for compassion gets bigger. So you start to think less about me and more about we. So all these changes are going on, but no one had told me any of this. And I was ranting about this to some friends and sharing my experience, and everyone kept saying, this is so helpful. We wish we'd known this. Why don't you start to talk about this publicly? And as is often, in that hero's journey curve, there was a lot of resistance. I did not want to do it. I am not naturally someone that wanted a platform. It just wasn't me. But the fire in my belly to communicate what I had been learning was burned so bright. I did it. And now, we have quite a big platform now. So we're about 4 million downloads on the podcast. We're often number 1 in the UK in the charts. We're growing a really, really engaged, supportive, incredible movement of mothers who are thinking about these changes as they enter motherhood. And instead of a time for it to be about, there's this in the UK, I don't know if you have in America, we have this sort of joking about mummies drinking wine and needing to get drunk to get through it. Motherkind is almost the opposite to that. Motherkind gives a load of incredible coaching tools, a load of ideas, wisdom, insight, phrases, tools like matrescence I was talking to help modern mothers navigate this in a completely different way, because the pressures on our generation are radically different than, even the generations before us, let alone the two before that. So that is where it came from and why I started it. Long answer.
No, I love it. I'm all about the long way around the barn, because that's where all the interesting stuff is, right? So something that resonates, part of why the popularity of your brand and of what you're doing and of what you're sharing is that it comes from such an authentic place. And, Deepak Chopra says, if you go through something that's painful and you come out the other side and you learn something that lessens your suffering, like you kind of have a moral obligation, according to Deepak, to share what you learned, because now you have the opportunity, which obviously you're doing, to lessen the suffering of others. It's like, we don't just discover this thing that like you felt liberated and like, okay, so there's a different way of doing this, and I'm not doing it all wrong, and I'm not, there's nothing wrong with me, basically. And now you're sharing it with others. Something you said at the top really struck me, that you'd been through your own therapy and done all of this work on your own healing, and how becoming a mother sort of reactivated, like enforced those old wounds or those old behaviors, or those behaviors that you thought you had gotten past. And I find that to be very true with my therapy clients. And something else, and I wonder, I'm going to ask you about your own experience, that in becoming a mother, I'm a stepmom. I inherited 3 young teen kids 25 years ago. So obviously they're just my family at this point. But what I found, I was into this instant parenting, and that at their ages, I started remembering things that I had forgotten about my own teen years, and things that were making me like so mad at my mother, and being like, hello, I was not home on a Tuesday night at like 2 a.m. and I was a sophomore in high school and you were fucking sleeping. Like, hello, did you care? Like, where I felt I didn't want to do that I was very into like what my kids were doing and where they were, and making sure that they were home at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. But this reinvigoration of wounds that they were subconscious or unconscious. And I see with my therapy clients that every stage and age of mothering can bring up wounds that were sort of sleeping. So please tell me, Zoe, this is what you do for a living. What is your take on that?
Well, that's one of the nuggets of gold that I discovered when I went on this discovery process of what is happening. And there's a famous psychotherapist here in the UK called Dr. Philippa Perry who wrote a book about this. And, I've spoken to her a lot, and it was incredibly helpful for me to learn that, because I think before you even do all the unpacking work of what that means, and even just knowing that, this is why I am finding my 7-year-old so challenging, because when I was 7, what was going on for me? And even, if that's all you do, if that is all the light that you shine on it, that is helpful. Just knowing that. I think the other thing that I had no appreciation of was that our children will trigger in us parts of ourselves that are underdeveloped. And those are the parts that we're going to want to shut down in them the most. So, for example, I have a 3-year-old who, like all 3-year-olds, she is incredibly boundaried. She speaks her mind. All the things that I'm working on, right? I'm working on trying to speak up more, trying to be more boundaried. And everything in me wants to shut those parts in her down. And lots of parenting, maybe slightly, 20, 30 years ago, lots of parenting would have encouraged that to shut down those parts. And I love the movement that we've got now, where it's actually, let's look at what that brings up for us in the parents, spearheaded by Dr. Shafali, of course, but now, so many of us talking about this. And I'm really passionate about mothers knowing this. Even just knowing it makes it easier, because it's so hard to go through your day feeling triggered and dysregulated from your children all the time and not knowing why. And of course, that makes you feel guilty. Why can't I just be like those mums that I see or hear or read about, or this parenting book is telling me I should be like? Right. It's because, like you said, Terri, it might be reactivating something, or something is being mirrored or triggered back to you. And just knowing that, I think, pours compassion over all parents, particularly mothers, because we tend to be the ones who pick up the guilt and think, I should be able to do this differently.
Yes. And the looking in, I mean, it's so funny you bring up Shafali, because I just interviewed her 3 days ago. Just did a live with her about her
book. Yeah.
Right. So the parent map, which I have right over here somewhere. But in that conversation, I will agree with your point of how looking in and that self-reflection is so healing unto itself. And part of it changes the dialogue, that dialogue of, why can't I be like other moms who are doing this and they make it look easy, but I'm struggling, or I'm not doing it right, or whatever. When you have a moment where you go, okay, I can pause long enough to go, I'm right now being triggered by my child. What in me? How is this familiar? Where have I felt like this before? What does this moment remind me of? And in doing that, and having it be a regular way, because I teach this to my therapy clients as well, like in any way being triggered, right? Where, as Shafali would say, right, your triggers are all within you. They're not outside of you. And so it's not a blame thing. It's an empowerment thing, that we can shed some compassion and light on why this might be painful, and we can make a different choice. Because when we don't do the self-reflecting piece, your behavior is being driven, fueled by this unconscious material. And that's when we really are like, why the hell am I like this? What is wrong with me? Like, why am I not doing it right? Or why does everyone else make it look easy, but it's not easy for me? Like, we all have our crap that we're carrying from childhood, even if you had a great childhood. Like, again, none of this is about dissing other people. It's about understanding if there is certain behaviors that are being triggered in you that are getting in the way of you being the parent that you want to be. It's valuable to look at. I wanted to ask you, you say, you talk about motherhood as an invitation to break old patterns. And you talk specifically about control, perfectionism, and people pleasing. So shall we dive into that?
Yeah, why not? Well, it's exactly what we're just talking to, isn't it? Is that, when we find something really hard, which most mothers, most parents, particularly mothers, my work is really with mothers. So I talk about the motherhood experience predominantly, not to say what we're talking about isn't relevant for all parents, but most mothers, when we find something really challenging, there's two ways through that, isn't there? There's to lean into that challenge and to think, what can I learn from this? Or there's to resist it. And that's where I think we get in all sorts of trouble with stress and overwhelm. And, so I'm all about helping mothers lean into that challenge. And I think one of the biggest opportunities that we've got in motherhood is how challenging it is. Everything that I spoke about. And I also know from my own experience that most of my growth has come through challenge. I'm sure you're the same, Terri. Like those qualities in myself that I've so desperately wanted to cultivate, like courage and surrender and wisdom, I've developed those through going through really hard things. And I think motherhood is the same. I think it's the same. And I think I find that really exciting, because if we start to look at it with that lens, then what we can start to do is think, okay, so I know that my child isn't going to listen to what I say. Essentially, children are little sponges, particularly up to the age of 7. They're actually in a different brainwave, as you'll know. So what are some of the qualities that I want to start being for my child, and just for myself, right? It's not just for the child, but what are some of those qualities that I want to start modeling? And where do I find that gap is? And it's in that gap that we get to do a little bit of self-exploration. And I'm a coach, so I would approach things differently than perhaps you would, Terri. I approach things with really practical, forward-looking questions, lots of journaling prompts. We use lots of analogies to help people really unpack, what is it about that control that you're finding really hard? You're telling me you want to be more easygoing, and this was my experience. I really want to just trust that my child will hit the milestones when they hit it, and it doesn't matter what everyone else is doing. And so it's just such an opportunity to realize, as I did, gosh, there's still so much fear in me. There was still so much fear, which of course came from, multiple generations of fear being passed down the line. So I think it's really interesting, exciting to think, okay, if I was going to alchemize some of that, what would that look like for me? How would I start to surrender more? And then running little experiments, which I love to do with clients. A little surrender experiment. What does it look like to not compare yourself for one day to someone? How do you feel? Just note down at the end of the day, and we start to get a bank of evidence. It's quite simple, and I think it has to be when I'm working with mothers, because anything too complex with the most time poor and stressed out demographic, I think, in society. So it's really simple, the interventions that I help mothers with, but incredibly effective in terms of helping people transform some of those things that they're struggling with for themselves, and then they're breaking that cycle.
And it's amazing to break the cycle. One of the things that I would see as resistance to breaking the cycle, because I'm sure you see resistance all the time, because this is any kind of transformative work, there's no possible way we don't bump up against this. But there's an unconscious part of a lot of people, and me too, and you too. I mean, this is just how it is, where if I do it better than my parents, if I do it better than my mother, is that bad? It's like feeling guilty for being more successful than your parents, let's just say. Or this is a common theme I've seen in therapy, and I've had it in my own experience, that even with being in a healthy marriage, it's like there was, in therapy, it came out, and this is, decades ago, but that there was a part of me that was worried that how would my sort of male bashing, female oriented family feel about me being in a happy marriage with someone who's a partner, and not all of those stereotypical untrue tropes about men, and that was a long time ago, and a lot has changed. But I feel like with motherhood, there is an unconscious desire to sort of be loyal to the way that we were raised. And so what you're saying, and what first of all, just what do you think about that?
That feels true. And I think it's incredibly hard. In my experience, my conditioning and my nervous system even got used to certain patterns of behavior. So I think even breaking that, so for example, something really practical and visual, like how the home looks. So growing up, my mum was amazing, my mum, and everything was just perfect on the outside. Like there was never a speck, a crumb of dust anywhere. It was perfect. And so when I choose to step outside of that, I really bump up against that conditioning, to the point where I can hear those internalized voices in my head. And that is just fascinating to me. I love thinking about this as interesting. Like I love using words like I'm so curious. That's so interesting to me, because I feel like with those words, they keep it lighter for me to then start to think about, okay, so I'm hearing these voices that I'm lazy, that I'm shameful, that I need to tidy, that my house is a mess, that ultimately I'm going to be unlovable because I'm not keeping. Isn't it interesting? And then it's just asking myself some really simple questions about that. Is that really true? Where's that come from? And how do I want to show up? And I think it's exactly what you're pointing to, Terri. I think just asking ourselves those questions is where so much of the freedom lies. Just in the asking. Because when we have the awareness about something, then we can do something about it, which I think is what you're talking to about, almost that upper limit problem. Like, am I allowed to go above this limit of happiness, of freedom, of expansion, of how I'm parenting, of how I am? We bump against that upper limit, and even shedding awareness on that limit transmutes it in itself, in my experience.
It does. It really does. That's a great point. I also think that, for me, when I was coming up against this about love and marriage, that in reality, my mother wanted me to do it better. In reality, my mother wanted me to have a love that lasted, because that's what I wanted, to have a family. She was so supportive of me marrying a widower with 3 kids, and was like, don't let anyone tell you that you're not a mom, Terri. This is like just so amazing. So the limiting belief and the fear of getting kicked out of like the tribe, it's not based in like what was necessarily the person's behavior. So much of this stuff is just unconscious fears, just human fight, flight, freeze, fawn type stuff, So it is interesting. I love the frame, Zoe, that you said about looking at things from being curious and, this is interesting, because it takes it away from the thought of right, wrong, functional, dysfunctional, healthy, unhealthy, like all of this black and white, good and bad stuff, which I feel like with parenting, and I feel like with everything, we just need more nuance, because we are, especially if you're interested in what Zoe's doing, you're already ahead of people, right? You're already ahead of most people who are just like doing whatever comes naturally, and that's it, So it's having a little grace, having a little compassion, knowing that we're doing the best that we can and that we want the best for our children. I feel like there's so much fear, and I wonder if you see this in your work. How many times clients would be like, I did this thing, something that I thought was a failure, and I'm worried I've ruined my kid.
Yeah. I've had that thought myself, and I'm steeped in this work all day, every day. I think partly the lens that I would put on that is that shows the level of love and care that I have for my children. Because parents that don't have those questionings of themselves tend to be the most disengaged. Like I sometimes say, if you're really worried about being a good mother, you already are one. Like it's that worry that shows your level of care. But like anything, when something gets outsized, when it gets out of its proportion, that's where it can become damaging, right? And those thoughts of, have I harmed my child by shouting at them once, or am I going to ruin their gut health because they had McDonald's? All that stuff where we just that is just the pressure that we put on ourselves. And I think in part we have to remember that we are raising children in an era where there is more knowledge than ever before about parenting. Ever before. Like, even my mum, let alone her mum, had no idea about the importance of the first 3, 5, 7 years, had no ideas about brain development. It just wasn't, parenting wasn't a verb, was it? It was just, you are a parent, and it was just,
right.
That was it. Now it's like a verb, it's a thing you do. And there's, and I think it's amazing. I'm part of that. I'm part of assimilating some of that parenting knowledge, like with, Dr. Shafali and others. I think it's really important. And we have to remember that we're raising our children in a time of lack of support, more lack of support than arguably we've ever had.
Absolutely.
So when those two things come together, I talk about this perfect storm that it's created for modern parents, in particular modern mothers, because we do tend to be the ones who put that extra pressure on ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really, really, really important for parents to remember that, yes, we have all this parenting knowledge, and it's incredible, and it's really profound to be curious about ourselves and what do we want to pass on and what do we break. And at the same time, we have to do it with a huge dose of realism, self-compassion. And remember that ultimately, when we love our children the best that we can, that is good enough. Back to the Donald Winnicott, good enough. The other thing that a therapist said to me once, which I found really helpful, it was actually before I was a mother, and I was really worried about becoming a mother. I was just married, and my husband was like, let's start a family. And we actually had to go into therapy because I kept saying, I haven't done enough healing yet. I haven't done enough healing yet. And this really wise therapist, she said to me, I'd make you one guarantee, Zoe, you will mess your children up. And I was like, oh, what? She was like, it's human. There's no one that comes out of childhood, unscathed. That is just the reality of it. That is the reality of it. She said, but you can show your children that there's something they can do about that. You can model self-development. You can model going to therapy. You can model talking about your inner critic, and you can model talking about your nervous system. And I do all of that. I model it. I don't teach my kids. I don't read them books on it. I just try and model it and exemplify it. So, I think it's really important to hold those two truths, knowledge and compassion.
But I love what the therapist said, because it's so true. My mother said her own version of it when I first got into therapy, and I couldn't wait to tell her all the ways she screwed me up and all the mistakes she made. And I remember I was 20 years old maybe, and I went to visit her, and I was like, yeah, and you did this, you did that, and blah, blah, blah. And she said, first of all, I never wanted to be on a pedestal. I knew this day was going to come. You always put me on a pedestal, and now here you come to kick me off. So thanks. But then she went on to say that was one experience. And then later, as I was getting older, going through therapy and still talking about things, she said, Terri, listen, you're not going to make the mistakes I made. You'll make all of your own.
It's true.
And I was like,
it's really true.
That's pretty accurate, Jenny. That's pretty right. And her point was also to say no one is perfect, and not being defensive of herself, just saying that, as the therapist said to you, this is part of the human condition. But one thing I think that can be really helpful in us understanding that we are flawed human beings, right? We all are. This is just life. That being able to take responsibility for and be sorry for the ways that we failed our children or will fail them or whatever. And I remember getting a note from my mother. I was in my early 30s at that point, and just basically a little note. I talked to her all the time, and her note was like, hey, I know I made some choices that, caused you pain, and I'm really sorry. I hope one day you can forgive me. I love you, Mom, or whatever. Like, it was the apology I didn't even know I needed. And yet it's something that made me feel so seen. And I had done a lot of therapeutic work at that point, and it wasn't dramatic, and she wasn't being a martyr, and it wasn't weird. It was just super loving and straight. And I was like, thanks. And I did the same exact thing to all of my kids. Because I made all my own mistakes, as she said I would. One last topic, Zoe, for you is, because this is a big one with my therapy clients, and people write into me all the time asking questions about mom guilt. Like, this shit is real. So what are your thoughts? And I know you have a way that you kind of reframe it. So please share.
Yeah. I mean, this was another thing that so when I was pregnant, people would say to me, oh, you give birth to the baby and you give birth to the guilt. And I just remember thinking like, okay, I didn't really know what they were talking about. And then, of course, in those early years of motherhood, I knew exactly what they were talking about. I felt guilty for everything. And it was kind of the narrative when I would look at popular books or even way that was talked about on TV or on social media, but that was just part of it. And as a coach and someone really interested in transformation and development and freedom, I started to feel really uncomfortable with that. I was like, I don't think that we should just accept feeling guilty as just part of the experience. So I started to really, really dig into it and research and understand where this comes from and why I think it is. And I've got two main ideas on this that I talk to. The first one is that outside of motherhood, when we talk about guilt, we tend to talk about where we've stepped outside our values, like we might have forgotten a friend's birthday or shouted at a parking attendant, and we feel guilty for that. And that is a good thing. That is something that developed in us, over millennia in order to help us repair and keep the tribe together. That is a good thing. When we talk about motherhood guilt, I think we're more often talking about shame. I love borrowing Brené Brown's definition here. So Brené Brown talks about guilt is I did something wrong. Shame is I am wrong.
Yep.
And I think when we think about motherhood guilt, when you ask mothers to really unpack, you will get to this core idea of I'm just not good enough. I am wrong. And I think the moment I started to understand this, it was like a light bulb going off, because I realized this isn't mum guilt. This is core female often, or people identify in that way, wounding of I'm not good enough. And of course, it plays out the strongest where we so want to be good enough in our relationship, where we just adore our children more than anything. So the moment I saw that, it completely transformed how I thought about guilt and how I help people reframe grief. Even understanding that, I think, is incredibly powerful and important. So if we go back to this idea of guilt, psychologists and therapists talk about productive guilt, which is the one I was talking about. Oops, I did something wrong. And unproductive guilt, which is just where we feel guilty, but actually we have nothing to feel guilty about. Now, there's never been a study on this, unfortunately, but I think when the thousands of mothers that I've spoken to about this, I think 98% of that guilt would be unproductive guilt. About 2% of it is, yes, there's something here for you. You might be shouting at your children too much. You might want to tweak how you are responding to that person, or your workaholism is kicking in and maybe you aren't seeing your children enough. That's about 2%. The rest of it comes from these societal standards that we've absorbed about what a good mother looks like.
And it's impossible.
Hence the reason why mothers will say, I feel guilty about everything, because we have absorbed this idea from books, fairy tale, romance, everything that we've been fed about women, that we become mothers and we forget our needs. So the moment you try and advocate for your needs, or you say to your kids, sit there, I'm going to do 5 minutes yoga, you start to feel guilty, because you're bumping up against that conditioning that says, no. A good mother is a martyr. A good mother lays herself, bare for the cross of her children. She forgets about herself. A good mother doesn't work. A good mother prepares home-cooked meals every single night. A good mother does not shout. And when I ask mothers this is a journaling exercise I ask my clients and people in my community to do, grab a piece of paper, write a good mother, ... and get out all of that conditioning. Your mind will be blown. What what comes out. That mothers should look a certain way, speak a certain way, act a certain way. It's mind-blowing what we have subconsciously absorbed from the world around us, of course, from our own experience of our mothers, from media, from what we've watched, from what we've read. Fairy tales have a lot to say here. So
Yeah, they do.
It's absolutely fascinating. And then when we've got all those out, then we start to ask this really empowering question, which is, okay, so those are the standards that I've absorbed. Those aren't my standards. What are the standards that I want to judge myself by? And that's where I get into values work with mothers, which is just transformational, because the moment, as you know, Terri, we can say, this is what is important to me. We get a set of standards that we can judge ourselves by. And then the guilt, my clients tell me, who I've gone through this process with, just becomes right-sized very, very, very quickly. And it's absolutely incredible to see mothers walking around with some freedom from that constant gnawing of feeling of guilt, which is just an awful way to live. It serves no one.
It sure is. It sure is. And that is super helpful. So you guys, there's the prompt for you from Zoe. Zoe, tell everyone where they can find you.
So Motherkind Podcast is where I show up most frequently. We do 2 episodes a week. We do a short one on a Monday and we do a longer one on a Thursday. And there'll be an episode coming out in a couple of weeks with Terri. We're recording, aren't we? So look out for that one. I've got episodes on there that cover everything from matrescence we were talking about. So the leading experts globally in matrescence. I always try and get the top expert with something on. My most popular episode is with Dr. Gabor Mate, where I think it's the only place that he's ever spoken specifically to the motherhood experience and how it intersects with his knowledge of child trauma and human development. So that is an episode that lots of people often start with. There's an episode there with Dr. Shafali, who Terri and I have in common. There's anything that you could be struggling with your motherhood journey, there will be an episode on the podcast with an amazing expert. It's remarkable, the people that I've been able to curate over 5 years. So that's where to find me. And then my website is motherkind.co. I do one-on-one coaching, but that's completely booked up with a wait list. But I do group programs and things open up. So do go and have a look there as well.
Well, thank you so much, Zoe. This really was a pleasure, and I really appreciate the work that you are doing in the world.
Oh, thank you, Terri. Likewise.